Welcome to this presentation of Santa Barbara banks and their trailblazers through vintage postcards and photographs. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. First, let me quickly review Part 1 highlights, where we examined the First National Bank and her adventurous founder, Mortimer Cook, William Eddy's County National Bank, Santa Barbara Savings and the Edwards banking family, and Dwight Murphy, Santa Barbara's Renaissance man. In Part 2, we will start with the Central Bank of Santa Barbara. Our fourth early bank, the Central Savings Bank, was opened in 1903. A.H. McKay was named president, and W.B. Metcalf, who up to that time had been cashier at the commercial bank, was made cashier. This beautiful structure was built in 1914 and was located at the corner of State and De La Guerra. The classic architectural style, with its intricate cut stone, stood out among the other wonderful stone buildings on State Street. T. W. Diblee became president of the Central Bank in 1920. Thomas W. Diblee was the son of Thomas Bloodgood Diblee and Francesca De La Guerra, Jose De La Guerra's granddaughter. She was the daughter of Pablo De La Guerra, who was one of the 7 sons of Don Jose De La Guerra, mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. It is possible that Pablo was one of the culprits snitching Don Jose's coins through the ceiling hole. Now for some background information on the Diblees. Thomas's brother Albert Diblee was a successful merchant and one of the most notable citizens of early San Francisco. The Diblee lineage traces back to 1630 in New England. Albert came to California in 1849 and tried his luck at mining, but soon realized that his experience in mercantile enterprises was much more suitable to him. Success did not come easy, as Albert experienced several major financial problems, including the fire of 1851 and the failure of the Wells and Cole banking house. But he persisted and established a successful shipping business. He was active in civic affairs, including being president of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. In 1858, he and a partner purchased the Santa Anita Ranch in the San Gabriel Valley. Albert's brother, Thomas Bloodgood Diblee, was a lawyer and junior partner in the New York law firm Hamilton Fish when Albert invited Thomas to come west to help manage the Santa Anita sheep ranch. During that time, the 1860s, Albert was the mercantile agent for William Wells Hollister and his sheep operations of the San Justo Ranch in San Benito County. Hollister had been approached to buy the Lompoc Rancho, 42,000 acres, and the adjoining Mission Viejo de la Purisma, 4,413 acres, for $60,000. A partnership was formed between Albert, 25%, Thomas, 25%, and Hollister, 50%, purchasing the 46,000 acres in 1863. In the meantime, 2 major events, which would have major financial consequences, were taking place. A prolonged drought had decimated Santa Barbara County's cattle and sheep populations, causing land prices to plummet, and the Civil War's need for wool caused the wool market prices to escalate. Albert remained in San Francisco as a commissioned wool merchant and shipping executive and business manager for the partnership. Tom moved to Santa Barbara to manage the sheep operation from the San Julian Rancho. Hollister sold part of his San Justo holdings, 21,000 acres, to an association of 50 farmers for $400,000. The association named the newly formed town Hollister, California. With Hollister's $400,000 bolstered by the Diblee brothers' wealth, the partnership set upon a land-buying spree. Adding to their Lompoc and La Purisma ranches, they purchased the Santa Rosa, Santa Anita, the Gaviota, the Espada, the San Julian, the Salsapuedes, and the Las Cruces ranches, containing some 160,000 acres in Santa Barbara County. Their holdings now extended for 40 miles along the Pacific coast and had upon them fully 60,000 sheep as well as many head of cattle. An article in the New York World newspaper described the Hollister Diblee ranch lands so vast that if they were made into a belt a mile wide, it would stretch from New York City to Washington, D.C. Hollister moved south to Santa Barbara and purchased the Glen Annie Ranch property, fulfilling an earlier vow. There, he built his mansion. Hollister immersed himself in many business and civic affairs of Santa Barbara, which were detailed in my presentation on the Arlington Hotel. Years earlier, Hollister, while sharing a stagecoach, had met Elwood Cooper, who was coming to California to establish a base for horticultural work. Hollister wrote Cooper that acreage adjacent to Glen Annie was available from the Den estate. Cooper bought the land, and they became neighbors and lifelong friends. Elwood Cooper went on to become the largest walnut grower in California and established for a short period of time the largest olive mill in the United States, which brings us to the controversy concerning the Glen Annie property. In 1876, the validity of land purchases from the Nicholas Den estate was called into question. For the previous 14 years, Charles Hughes, an attorney, handled the Den estate. He was accused of mishandling affairs, including the sale of Den real property to Hollister, Cooper, and others. Legal proceedings embraced 2 separate trials, which dragged on for a decade. In 1885, the final court decision was handed down. But before we get to the outcome, let me convey 2 related stories. First, during the court proceedings, Hollister, not happy with his legal counsel Charles Fernald, wired Albert asking him to find the best lawyer available. Albert responded naming Samuel Wilson of Wilson & Wilson, San Francisco. Wilson required a $1,000 retainer, to which Hollister said, "I wanted a lawyer, not a pirate." Secondly, I could not pass up this note written by Elwood Cooper. Quote, "Colonel Hollister and I just had to pay the lawyers $9,000. It is an outrage beyond all my experience in legal proceedings. I ought to let my ranch go. It is more humiliation to give it to the lawyers than it would be to let the Dens take it back. On this basis, it may cost $25,000 in legal fees. I see little hope in the future of California. There are too many lawyers. The public welfare is imperiled. In Santa Barbara, a greater set of asses never existed. Those alive 50 years from now will see the necessity of forming vigilante committees and hanging half the lawyers, end quote. Elwood wisely settled before the final decision. Hollister did not. The court ruled that the Dens were entitled to recover all the Dos Pueblos property sold by Hughes. A devastated Hollister's only hope, the Supreme Court might decide that he had purchased the property in good faith and was therefore entitled to get his money back. While awaiting the appeal, Hollister was rejuvenated by the visit of Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter. Not covered in my Arlington Hotel presentation was the following information intertwining the princess's visit to Santa Barbara and members of the Hollister, Diblee, and Cook families. The festivities included a greased pig chase that youngster J. James Hollister won. 2 of Thomas Diblee's children were allowed a private audience with the princess, and Mortimer Cook's niece sat on the princess's lap during a piano recital held in her honor. Colonel Hollister died in August of 1886 before the California Supreme Court's decision. He was buried in the Santa Barbara Cemetery, mourned by a procession that stretched for 3 miles. Newspapers from coast to coast professed him to be one of California's greatest pioneers. Later, after learning of the court's final decision to award Hollister's beloved Glen Annie to the Den estate, his wife, Annie Hollister, swore that no member of the Den family would ever set foot in her house. 15 minutes after Annie had vacated the premises on November 20th, 1890, the house mysteriously burst into flames and burned to the ground. Annie went to her grave in 1909 claiming that she did not know what had caused the fire. Let's turn back the clock for a little discussion on Thomas Diblee. He managed the sheep and cattle operations from the San Julian Ranch. He was elected president of the predecessor to the Chamber of Commerce in Santa Barbara in 1873, but because of his duties at the ranch, he removed himself from that office. In 1882, the Diblee-Hollister partnership was dissolved, and Rancho San Julian went to the Diblees. Let's briefly look at the San Julian's history. In these 5 pictures are Juan Alvarado, governor of Alta California, Jose de la Guerra, Pablo de la Guerra, Francesca de la Guerra Diblee, and the main ranch house at St. Julian. In 1837, Alto, or Upper California's governor, Juan Alvarado, granted Jose de la Guerra ownership of Rancho San Julian. Upon his death, the rancho passed to his sons, including previously mentioned Pablo de la Guerra. The result of the severe 1864 drought forced the de la Guerras to sell to the Hollister-Diblee Ranching Partnership in 1867. Then, the ranch reverted back to the de la Guerra family when Thomas Diblee married Don Jose's granddaughter, Francesca. The rancho has remained in the hands of his descendants ever since. Today, Rancho San Julian is still a working family ranch. Hundreds of cattle roam the remaining 13,000 acres. Fruits and vegetables flourish in the flatlands, and extensive honeybee colonies inhabit the valley. Today, the San Julian has been placed in an agricultural preserve status and serves as a refuge for a variety of local wildlife. During those days, the stage line passed through the San Julian for a distance of 17 miles. Thomas Diblee would padlock the gate once a year to circumvent the law that if a public conveyance uses a private road for 365 consecutive days, it would become public property. In this vintage photograph, Thomas Diblee is in the center and Francisca Deleguera Diblee to his left. Now, leaving the country, let's get back to the city. The palatial Punta del Castillo, or Castle Point, was located at the current site of City College overlooking West Beach. The castle was one of Santa Barbara's most elaborate 19th century homes. Built in 1886 in the Italianate style, it was designed by architect Peter J. Barber for Thomas B. Diblee, millionaire owner of the vast San Julian sheep ranch. In 1895, Santa Barbara mourned the death of Thomas Diblee, age 72. On the left is an article from the newspaper, the San Francisco Call, lamenting his passing. Ironically, his brother Albert Diblee died that same year. On the right is an article written 2 years later in 1897 concerning leasing the property to a merchant from New York at $9,000 per year, a hefty sum in those days. The mansion sustained major damage during the 1925 earthquake and was torn down in 1932, ending nearly a half-century of its tower dominating Santa Barbara's western skyline. The bank is shown here on this tin bank, which was given away as advertising to its customers. Which brings me to the last of the early banks. In 1914, the Fugazi Popolare Bank of San Francisco established a branch in Santa Barbara at 500 State Street. The bank specialized in agricultural and rural loans and serviced an expanding Italian population seeking better opportunities in our growing city. Here's an interior view of the Fugazi Bank, with tellers at their stations ready to serve. The local branch was very successful. According to an article in the Evening News San Jose, California, dated 5 January 1928, the Bank of Italy, founded by Amadeus Giannini, purchased the Santa Barbara branch of the Fugazi Popolare Bank and renamed it the Bank of Italy. It was housed in the Neil Callahan Building at the corner of State and Coda, location of the current Barbara Hotel. One of the successful Italian families of Santa Barbara, the Giordano's, did their banking at the Bank of Italy. Giordano's name, associated with quality foods and beverages throughout Southern California, is the second oldest business in our city. In 2015, it will be celebrating 100 years of business in Santa Barbara. In 1928, the Bank of Italy merged with a much smaller bank, the Bank of America of Los Angeles, and 2 years later, Giannini changed the name from Bank of Italy to Bank of America, a name that has endured to this day. Now let us turn our attention to Santa Barbara's current bank. I thought a good place to start would be to look at the telephone directory. So I looked up banking in the Santa Barbara Yellow Pages, and this is what I found. American Riviera Bank, Bank of America, Bank of Manhattan, Santa Barbara, Bank of Santa Barbara, Business First Bank, Chase, Community West Bank, First Bank, First Republic Bank, Herb Leviton Chase Com, Idea Bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, Montecito Bank and Trust, Northern Trust Bank, Pacific Western Bank, Rabobank, Santa Barbara Bank and Trust, don't know why they're still there, State USA, the Bank of Santa Barbara, U.S. Bank, Union Bank, and Wells Fargo Bank. I got a headache looking at the list and trying to determine which and how many of these institutions I would talk about in this presentation. I decided right then and there that the event that sparked my interest in the first place would be a fitting way to conclude the presentation. As my wife Carol and I were walking down State Street on a fine day in April 2013, we noticed some activity in front of the Bank of Montecito's main office at State and Carrillo. Remember our old friend and founder William Eddy of Was the Town Big Enough for Two Banks fame? Well, this iconic building was designed for County National Bank by Myron Hunt Architect. It was completed in 1921 in the Italianate style after the de' Medici family chapel in Florence, Italy. In the 1950s, County National Bank was sold to Crocker Bank. After several other owners and tenants, it was acquired by Montecito Bank and Trust in 1978. In this invitation dated January 25, 1979, President Roy Gaskin states, and I'll read a part, "A historic building is being reborn in downtown Santa Barbara, and we're inviting you to our celebrations. The downtown office of the Bank of Montecito is moving into the original County National Bank and Trust building at 1000 State Street, corner of State and Carrillo. Built in 1921, the building survived the major Santa Barbara earthquake, 1925, and became well known as the location of the city's most prestigious and most beautiful bank, the County National Bank." As Carol and I hurried along to see what was happening, a half a dozen men were lifting a huge frame off of a special truck. The bank's huge front doors had been removed to allow workmen to gently try and angle in the huge 10.5 foot by 13.5 foot work of art in trying to get it into the bank. Yes, the magnificent painting, Grosbeck's The Landing of Cabrillo, was coming back to its original home. Looks like it'll just make it. The calculations were correct. Once inside, the next step was to get it up to where it had been over 50 years before. A happy ending with cooperation among several community organizations making it happen. But wait, not so fast. Controversy immediately reared its ugly head. In 1961, the painting was removed and put in storage for decades. In the early 1990s, it was donated to the Museum of Art, which lacked the space to display it, so it was moved to the courthouse. Paperwork was written transferring ownership to the Courthouse Docent Council, and then it was mounted in the courthouse for display for 2 decades. The bank requested the painting be returned to its original home, and the Docent Council enthusiastically agreed. Then, a local attorney questioned the Docent Council's ownership of the painting and demanded it be brought back to the courthouse. The bank, not wanting to create any further controversy, relented and agreed to return it. Today, as I understand it, the painting of our city's generous benefactor, Dwight Murphy, will be removed from its current place in the courthouse and be replaced with the Grosbeck painting, thus ending our presentation on a somber and sour note. An update as of today. Good news. The current situation has the Groesbeck painting returned to its former place in the courthouse and the Dwight Murphy painting staying in its original location. As for Montecito Bank and Trust, after spending what might be $200,000 in this adventure, the bank quietly commissioned a laser-based full-size replica and put it where the 1924 painting was originally displayed.